out of like every chemical that I've done, it's the only one where I truly saw things in a three-dimensional space that were not there. Interacted with, spoke, heard auditory hallucinations, visual, like saw people and things that just weren't there. And that's where I would see the shadow people. And I remember one distinct night where as soon as I turned the lights off, these beings would descend from the ceiling and they would like rise up from the floor, rise up from the floor, rise up from the floor. I wrote this down in my journal, and it was that since Nephilim got punished, since the Watchers got punished for physically procreating, they figured out that they can promulgate their spirits through drugs. So they can still communicate through people through these hallucinogenic experiences.
The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
The Smithsonian, if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm.
It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
Well, Jed, a lot has happened since our episode with you. I think it was episode.
Yeah, dude. What is it, Enoch, right?
Yeah.
The Book of Enoch.
I listen to it every night going to sleep. Just want to hear your voice.
That's how he racked up so many plays.
Well, that was really around the time when you full pivoted to like what the show is now.
Yeah.
Because it was originally just a straight up like cryptids.
Yeah.
And then
we hold loosely to that still, Jed. It just
of course.
This is broad strokes.
Yes. I don't remember, Nate, like what because you had started texting me someone you had stumbled onto about the Nephilim stuff, and you were texting me about it, and I was like, oh, he's like Heiser. He's like I was 4 years ago when I had just stumbled upon it, and it blew my mind. The conspiracy theory to end all conspiracy theories.
Yeah. I was telling a friend the other day, I grew up in like 25 different Christian circles, between all the girls that I liked in various youth groups, to camps, to, Christian organizations, to bands that were quasi-Christian. And nobody talked about any of this stuff, but we all knew the Bible, but we didn't understand. You get to a point where you're like, I don't understand any of this basically the Old Testament was kind of like, everyone just put a big question mark over it. And now it's like, it's crazy, but I get it,
Yeah. It really puts the Bible into a cohesive narrative.
Exactly.
But it really, I still haven't heard of anyone that goes to a church that talks about that kind of thing.
Chuck Missler had a church that did. There are pastors
There's one down the street talking about our podcast, Nate.
That's right.
Is there really?
Conduit Church is down the street from where I live, and they for whatever reason, I got a buddy that goes there, and so shout out to the Conduit Church people out there. But I guess that some of the leadership there, and pastor there, they listen to the show, and we're lucky to have them. They shouted out in the service, and my buddy Dave is like, "Oh, I know one of those guys. He lives down the street."
What?
And they're like, "What?"
It's gotten wild, Jed. Like a lot of Christian artists that I never thought would be into this stuff are following us all of a sudden, and pastors shouting out from stage, like Luke said. I think everyone's waking up.
Yeah, what was that conference you went to?
Tim Malbarino's conference.
Yeah.
Birthright.
That's crazy.
I think it's interesting that what you're saying, Nate, like to get back to all the circles. I think it speaks to the idea that like and we've said this before, this is not like a new mantra, but the idea that people just don't know what's in their Bible, it's so often I think we just listen to whoever filters it for us, right? And the reality is that most of the people filtering it, as we were growing up, Nate, and probably in a lot of ways in the Western church are filtering it through through a very narrow, very academic, sort of quasi-enlightenment, lens.
Medieval.
Right, and I think that's why Heiser is such a paradigm shift in some ways for a lot of people, right? And we talk about Bigfoot being the gateway drug, but understanding these things around us that don't really make sense in that worldview really makes you wonder, okay, now we start looking at the Hebrew, and it's not at all what we thought it was necessarily. Or maybe it's much more than we thought it was. Maybe it's not, it is, and I think that's probably more accurate.
And
statement.
then some.
And then some, yeah.
It's funny. I had this conversation with my old boss yesterday. I guess he's reading some book called like reading the Bible through like Western culture or something, and he was talking about how a lot it's been like a game of telephone from poorly educated preachers that have we all just take these things for granted, like because it's just been passed down. And I want to shout this book out. I'm rereading it because I love it. One of my favorite authors, Philip Yancey. He was an editor for Christianity Today for a long time. He writes amazing books, but it's called The Bible Jesus Read. And it's basically all about like why the Old Testament matters and why it's important. So I will shout that out to anyone that's curious about it.
Shout out to Yancey.
We need to write one. Our changing bodies from junior high. You know what I mean?
Oh my gosh.
Our changing church body.
That's good.
That took a hard right turn there. Where's this going?
Where's he going with this?
That just reminded me of the sex ed video we had to watch in middle school, and it was like straight from 1986, and it was two neon outlines of a male and female body, just the silhouettes, and the narrator was like, at a certain age the young male's body gets activated, and then it like starts flashing red, like whoa, 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 whoa.
Watch out.
I always thought that was hilarious.
That's how I felt spiritually. At a certain point you get to a certain age and your spiritual body gets activated, right? Like in a cheesy, weird way. I think Luke and I were just like, who cares what people think about us? Let's just go down the trail. Let's just follow the trail. Like L.A. Marzulli says, the trail of the Nephilim. And when you go down the trail, you have to have sort of a scientific, like, I'm just going to keep following the cards and the data where it goes, and I'm not going to try to craft this narrative. And I think Luke and I are old enough to where we're like, I don't care if all of our friends think we're nuts. We're still going to do it. We're still going to like ask the questions, do the interviews, make the material, put it out in the world. And a lot of people are afraid, Jed. They're just afraid of what people are going to think about them.
Right. And it's like, it's fine. It's fine to be, you're not going to be 100% right. You're not going to be 100% wrong. Like it's more, because I've listened to a ton of your episodes where I'm like, I don't think that's right at all. But but this is what I like about it, is that it's kind of the whole, and people have lost this art where if you're really curious about something, go listen to an argument for it, go listen to an argument against it, and come to your own conclusion. And that's like what I was doing, where I was like listening. It's like, okay, I've heard this, what I think. And some things I'm like, yeah, that makes complete sense. And some things I'm like, I don't know.
But we're not willing to deviate from things like the giants existed. Like,
sure.
I think we've proven that. Like how big, where,
And I've been like Matt Carter famously ridiculed me for that when Joey brought me on Bad Christian to talk about it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do. I believe that was,
and we all know those
historically,
guys too.
Dude. Oh yeah, dude. I know those guys real well.
Yes, historically and factually true. I do think so.
Exactly.
That's actually going to be one of
if there's one thing we've done on this show, it's proved that point right there. That's the one thing I think in the first 100 episodes we really wanted to hammer home, and I think we did.
I'm trying to make. So, are you like familiar with Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So I'm trying to meld it in my mind and get like a working combined theory, but their whole thing about the Younger Dryas cataclysm that happened in 1300 or 15,000 years ago, that is what would have wiped out Atlantis and all that. That's essentially what I'm thinking as like the flood. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. That's a working thing in my mind, or at least that was the end of the old civilizations, like the golden age, whoever built the pyramids, whoever built the pyramids in South America, all the ancient technologies, Atlantis, all that stuff.
Yeah. And we've gotten into all those weeds trying to build a pretty good case for the golden age, what it was like. And the weird thing is it just gets more difficult to understand because you have all these empires all over the world. I mean, are like mini Atlantises in Peru, even in Japan, and they were building some of that stuff even in North America. Like Luke and I we tracked down this book of this. They found this ancient temple in Tennessee of all places when building a dam. It was like the giants were building. They were starting to build.
The wall in Texas, or
the
rock wall in Texas is another thing.
Yeah, it's kind of in a pseudo-Egyptian sort of temple thing. There's one. This apparently was one in the Grand Canyon. We had a members episode about that too.
Yeah,
all kinds of weird stuff you can't explain. And
what were they? Yeah,
I think you made a good point, Jed. I think that like there's a huge miss today in discourse and the idea that like it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to want to think about things. And I think people work backwards. They have this they have this idea of what they want it to be, and they want this, and they craft the narrative backwards, like, cherry pick. This is what's happening in our society today. Everybody cherry picks the things they want, they're trying to support, and they throw out everything else. And I don't think that's what Nate and I ever wanted. We always wanted to be on the journey as well, right? And ask some questions. Like, there's a ton of weird stuff in the Bible. What do we do with that? There's weird stuff people are seeing. What do we do with that? And we know what we believe, right? So we want to look at that through a biblical lens, because that's the foundation for us. And
Bigfoot gives you the permission to get weird.
Yeah. Well, and even in talking about what I was saying about hearing an argument for and an argument against, like the anthropology class I just had to take in college, I have never rolled my eyes more during. It's like, oh, okay, so for 350,000 years, humans were just like, I'm just gonna hit something with a rock, and then magically one day just decided to like get smart. Like my summation of that anthropology class was like a history of people just accidentally discovering these and that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today with drugs, especially that's one of my I've yet to really hear a convincing argument otherwise that makes sense to me. It just seems like so blind faith. I'll kind of put
that. What a great segue.
Yeah, what a great segue.
It's like you've done this before.
Welcome.
Listen to Church and Other Drugs.
Exactly. Welcome back to the podcast, Jed. I'm going to try not to call you Jed, because you said I did that once. We had Jed.
We got Jeds. We need good Jeds, Juds. You
called Jed though, and that made me feel happy. Yep, I
did the opposite. Okay, good. But welcome back to Blurry Creatures, sort of the grandfather of helping me into the blurry space. Thanks for encouraging me to get blurry.
Yeah.
And it was a big part of, starting Blurry Creatures. And, I came on your podcast a couple times, Church and Other Drugs.
Yeah.
And where you talk about your experiences with recovery and drugs. And we just had Amy and Kara on our show talking from the Not So Secret Societies podcast, which just comes out today, that episode. And she talks about seeing grays while on drugs and psychedelics. And, doing the show, Jed, I've thought about it a lot, that the corruption of creation, they were messing with everything. I'm wondering if the Watcher tech spread to psychedelics and drugs and plants, and they were teaching them oh, hey, if you eat this mushroom, you're gonna go to outer space. You ready?
Well, check it. It's right in the text, right? Okay, so
I love it. Let's go. So we're gonna talk about the blurry creatures of drugs. That was what that was the bow I wanted to wrap on that.
Yes. And so this is out of the Book of Enoch. So there were 13 named watchers, and they were named because they were attributed certain things they taught humanity. Okay, like Azazel taught men to make swords, daggers, shields, and the beautifying of the eyelids. So we have him to thank for cat eye and smoky eye. Thank you, Azazel.
Smoky.
Wow. But so
what a solid contribution.
For real. So Amezarek taught all those who cast spells and cut roots. Armoros, the release of spells.
Cut roots.
Yeah, I'll get there. And Kokubiel, portents. So, and in some of the translations, it's pharmakia. So basically, we have an original attribution of who taught men what plants to eat for drugs, right? So not to be full, this is a bad thing. We all, because of, all modern medicine, except for strictly synthetics, come from plant sources. And even synthetics, originally, they get the ideas from plants, right? So it was a good thing, antibiotics, all sorts of things. Well, that's a different class. But, pain relievers, anti-anxiety meds, all sorts of things we learned from plants. My question for anthropologists, let's take ayahuasca, for example, DMT. How many plant species would you reckon are in the Amazon?
Millions.
Lots and lots and lots.
1 million.
Yeah, with the Dr. Evil. So we're led to believe that early humans somehow took a vine that was so DMT in the plant form is not orally bioactive, which means you can't get an effect from it by eating because of something called monoamine oxidase inhibitors that are in your body, or monoamine oxidase. What you need is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor to prevent the monoamine oxidase from breaking down the chemical. So what they did was they took a vine, which had the DMT, and then a plant that was an MAOI, combined them, and bam, you have a bioavailable oral form of DMT that works. How would you figure that out without someone telling you?
Mm-hmm.
Like the narrative is trial and error. That's what they say, trial and error. They just figured it out.
Mm-hmm.
I can't think of a reason why you would do that. Number one, either they got extraordinarily lucky, or like Enoch says, they were taught, which Occam's razor makes a whole lot more sense to me.
Yeah.
You have the early Mayans that were really big they're war gods, and one Mayan leader specifically communicated with his god through Amanita muscaria mushrooms. That was how he talked to him. And if you ask them, like their records, they were being told how to do these things. How did you know how to build the temples? We were told. How did you know how to do this? We were told, right? So that makes sense to me, that humans were taught how to make these chemicals. So,
yeah, 'cause, I mean, you would have had to have the scientific wherewithal to understand the compounds, right? And then hey, this goes with this and goes with this, and
right?
Yeah, it seems a very very much a far fetched. I mean, if you're playing the other thing that we hear, right, is if you play the devil's advocate to this point and to your point, and probably our point is, well, if you had millions of years to keep trying, and just like, man, I don't know how you just keep trying stuff until it.
Why would you keep trying?
Until it shoots you into the stratosphere, right? Like it just doesn't. It's a tough one.
I mean, not only do we talk about how, they say the Native Americans built these mounds in North America, just the mounds themselves, but they needed advanced mathematics to build these mounds because they're advanced trigonometry in terms of how they're built. And some of these things, you can only see what they are from space. So you get way up high and you can see what they were building. You're like, how did they how did they know how to build it perfect if they didn't have, aerial vehicles
or something?
And that's just
a great height,
right?
Yeah.
And that's just one faction. You're talking about all kinds of mystery, sects of knowledge that we weren't supposed to have, and pharmakia is just one of them. But on our show, we've talked about several of them being, they had to have gotten this knowledge from something that was superior to them. And where did it come from?
And you talked about the Greys. I mean, where we get the Greys from, right?
Crowley?
Yeah, from Crowley.
So that's this week's episode. That's why it's so cool that this episode's coming out right after we're putting out the Crowley episode. That's what we're talking about this week.
Hey, I think it might be good to level set just for a quick second though, for people that aren't super familiar, right? Like,
yeah.
So we talk about ayahuasca. That's a South American tea that the natives make. So and it's really come into sort of its own, I think, in the last.
It has. Ayahuasca tourism is huge.
Dude, there's retreats. I mean, I was watching a surfing documentary, and they were doing these ayahuasca yoga retreats where they would go on these spirit journeys, right? And literally what it is it's a tea, and when it's prepared the way that we just talked about, you get the DMT becomes orally active, and DMT is dimethyltryptamine, which is a very powerful, and what the scientific community would call a hallucinogenic, right? Mm-hmm. But we know that all of these things that these are, and this is what Nate and I talked about in our last episode as well. These are ways to access the spiritual realm. These are ways to access other realms. And just like you eloquently pointed out, it was taught by the Watchers, and pharmakia, which I think is not at all a coincidence, is that word itself means sorcery, magic, the practice of magic arts. It also has the pharmakon has a primary meaning poison. So you have these crazy things that we're supposed to suppose that humans just tripped into and figured, that's a pun right there, but tripped into to figure out what they were doing, right? And it's an absurd. You're right. Like the more obvious answer is that we were taught, just like you said, like the South American kings, and we're told how to build and what to build and how to communicate. But because of the rise of this, and because we're going to talk about the Greys, and because we talked about Aleister Crowley in our last episode here, there is so much relevance, I think, that where we're on this journey, understanding that, because we've talked about the realms, Nate. We've talked about accessing the realms and what people are seeing. And I kind of just wanted to level set there, Jed, because I don't know how experienced everybody.
I forget to define terms.
Right, just so we can make sure everybody's riding in the same boat.
Yeah, you're
right
deep
now.
down the rabbit hole.
Yeah,
but continue now, because I think you're starting on a good point. So we talked to Kara last week, and she's saying that one of the things that she saw on her hallucinogenic trips and journeys, whatever you want to call them, that she saw the Greys.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So and I wanted to talk a little bit about the things I've seen and kind of my what I think about all that, because I've flip-flopped. I also kind of maybe at the end. And I've had the question too, right? Of, okay, God created everything, and everything was good. So is there a purpose in God's creation for things like mushrooms, for things like ayahuasca? And I mean, mushrooms need no preparation whatsoever. They grow, you ingest them, they do their thing. Same with things like peyote. Like ayahuasca, you have to do a little tampering to, but things like peyote and mushrooms, it is what it is. So it's like, is there? And I know a lot of people, especially recently, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill W., famously later in his life, he had this massive, he called it a white light spiritual experience in a hospital room, which is partly what prompted him to found Alcoholics Anonymous. Later in his life, LSD had just come around, and he wanted to have another spiritual experience, and he dabbled in LSD and did. And even they've since kind of retracted it as like, maybe that's not such a great idea, which I agree with. But he even was like, hey, if people are having trouble with spiritual experiences, give them some LSD and that'll certainly do the trick, which is true. I just want to get this out of the way because I hate, as someone who has tripped extensively, I cannot stand the argument that Christianity was just some mushroom cult, or like that the whole Bible was, all of the visions were just, they were just tripping. And that's what it's like. It doesn't work that way. Like I would not be willing to die and be martyred for something I believed on a mushroom trip. It just doesn't work that way.
Right. Like, we had 11 of 12 disciples, or
yes,
10 of 11 essentially die for their faith.
Brutally.
Yes. It wasn't because they went trippy dippy.
Yeah, horrible suffering, humiliating, excruciating deaths.
Well,
that's
not only that, but we have just thousands of prophecies in scripture that have come true.
It's
all
such
the geography,
a weak argument.
All the geography is accurate. All the ancient stories, and we just keep digging up more and more on our show and going, wow, the Bible is so much more loaded and fascinating and intense. And even in some of the things that just like we've talked a lot about Mount Hermon and just that one mountain and that one region. And then you see this in Bashan, they have these giant snake mounds, and they're building the same structures all over the world, the same ones that they talk about in the Old Testament. And you're like, well, those are in our backyard, And
like there was an argument that the burning bush that Moses, is that right? Yeah, Moses saw. Yeah. People were like, that was the acacia bush, which grows in the region and also has DMT in it. And that people were like, oh, that's exactly what it was. It was this burning bush. But Hamilton Morris from Vice famously actually tested it, and he got a crap ton of acacia bushes, burned them, and he was like, yeah, that's not true. It's not enough to do anything. So it's things like, I just want, if anyone has heard those arguments before, if you have the lived experience of like doing these things, it just doesn't work that way. It's not going to provide these. You're gonna, a month later, you're gonna question even what you saw. But so my journey with hallucinogens and psychedelics started in very frightening fashion. It's surprising that I kept going with it, but with things like Benadryl and Dramamine, okay, which might surprise some people, but those are incredibly potent hallucinogens. The class that they're in is actually called deliriants. They're in the same family as a plant, angel trumpets, if you've seen those flowers, and Jimson weed and scopolamine. Have you ever seen some movies where it's like in third world tribes, they'll blow that called devil's breath. They'll blow a white powder in someone's face and turn them into a zombie. You familiar with that?
Yeah. I mean, I've seen that image.
Yeah. So that's scopolamine, which is actually in motion sickness medication. It's funny like what's at the grocery store and what its origins are. So these are incredibly, incredibly potent things, right? And as a young kid, I was taking them, and that was the first time I experienced what are colloquially, I can never say it. Colloquially? Say it for me.
Colloquially?
See, it's tough. The shadow people. Have y'all heard the shadow people?
Yeah. So when you're saying like when you're just, it's kind of like Lil Wayne, like you're just drinking cough syrup, or enough of it, like in the same way. You're taking enough of this, Benadryl and Dramamine to cause you to trip.
Yes.
Okay.
Which you have to take a lot, and it's a very. Hopefully, no one's thinking that's a good idea. It's a very unpleasant and terrifying experience. It's the only, out of like every chemical that I've done, it's the only one where I truly saw things in a 3-dimensional space that were not there. interacted with, spoke, her auditory hallucinations, visual, like saw people and things that just weren't there. And that's where I would see the shadow people. And I remember one distinct night where as soon as I turned the lights off, these beings would descend from the ceiling and they would like rise up from the floor, kind of like, you remember that show, Alex Mack, The Secret World of Alex Mack?
I never watched it. But when you did that little motion, you look like one of those little...
like a marionette almost.
Like those little,
inflatable
inflatable dudes in front of car dealerships. Yeah.
Like how they inflate, that's like how they came out of the floor. Like they would kind of like corporealize out of the floor. Always in corners, leering and staring. And it was accompanied by a feeling of... It felt like the Upside Down. Like that's a great modern.
How do you know they weren't
reference. That's what I'm saying. Like they may have been. I don't know. Like the feeling now, it really seems like someone flipped a light switch and you are in, or like the movie Silent Hill, where like you're in the same room, but you're in the same room in a parallel reality.
Because I mean, we've gotten a lot of emails like that, Jed. Like people see this stuff. It doesn't sound like everyone's taking drugs when they're seeing it. It sounds like a lot of people they don't want to see it. So they're not obviously inducing it. So it makes me wonder.
Yes, I know. And it could very well be, and I've thought a lot about this, and it could be that it creates thin spots. It creates veils. It could be switching the vibration of, the wavelengths. This is like a pet theory, but how they called Lucifer the angel of light. And when you're on hallucinogens, your pupils are fully dilated, letting in as much light as possible. And that is probably has something to do with what you're seeing differently. That's very much a pet theory that's not backed by anything other than like, that's an interesting thing. I wonder if that has anything to do with anything, because it's cats and dogs and birds and and insects especially can essentially see the things around us. Like, did you know that humans like have stripes?
What?
Like under certain wavelengths, like we have stripes.
Didn't know that.
I didn't either. That's crazy.
What do you mean?
Wow.
Light?
Yeah, like we like, you know how things look under a black light, like under a certain wavelength, we have some sort of like markings on us. Look it up. It's crazy.
Like zebras.
Something like that.
Or zebra. It was zebra if you're Canadian.
Zebra. So after that, I moved on to things like mushrooms. Things like that really, really do. They open my eyes to the absolute certainty that what we see is not all there is. And the fact that modern science, with all its bells and whistles, still has very little idea of how these chemicals do what they do. They infer that it has something to do with HT2A serotonin receptors, and it may do this and it may do that, but they really have no clue. There's no agreed upon. They don't even know why we need to sleep. We don't know what sleep is. There's all these, like, talking about what you were saying earlier, Luke, about things that people just take for granted. Like, oh yeah, we need to sleep. We dream. They don't know why. Like, evolutionarily, how does it make sense that at the most dangerous part of the day, when it's dark, our body's like, all right, time to shut off.
Yeah.
Like,
it doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense. And we don't know why.
And everyone's always chatting in our channels and saying us that when you are asleep, you are spiritually vulnerable.
It would make sense.
Not only physically vulnerable to like animals and wolves and things, you have to build some kind of shelter, but you're spiritually vulnerable to, dreams and attacks. I mean, we're going to interview several people.
Sleep paralysis.
Yeah, it's nonstop. I mean, we've had probably half of the weird experiences that people send to us on email is something to do with them. They were sleeping. It was nighttime. It doesn't make any sense to me. So here's a question for you, Jed. Just, we know after doing this show that things are in the world that shouldn't have been in the world. Right? So the giants weren't supposed to be here. They took something and they messed with it. And then all of a sudden we had this race of beings that weren't supposed to be here, and they were here a long time. And they did the same thing with animals, and we had these chimerical creatures that some people have emailed us and said their great-grandfather saw them, you know, and you're like, and we have sightings like Bigfoot, and a lot of people think it's in that, you know, category of something that shouldn't be here that's still here.
Perverted nature.
Perverted nature. Are there plants and mushrooms and things that shouldn't be here that are here?
What I think what I've kind of come to is that, so I believe that coca leaves, the opium poppy, marijuana, what else? Things as they occur in nature, I think absolutely God put them here because we break our bones, because we skin our knees, because XYZ. But we have taken these things and concentrated, extracted. I mean, you know, fruits ferment naturally, but to make Everclear, you got to, you know, really put some work into it
and heat it up and really,
yeah. So it's like I absolutely think these naturally occurring things were a gift, and probably, well, Noah was like the first recorded alcoholic, but I was gonna say you know, the way things occur in nature. It was probably difficult to become like addicted as we see today with these things that are just like hyper. Oh gosh, I can't think of the word.
They're just ultra manipulated.
Yes.
Or hyper concentrated.
Hyper concentrated. That's what I was
right. It's the idea of the concentration levels that we're able to manipulate it up into, like you said, to like an Everclear, to like a 98% alcohol. Like
yeah, and even
normal fermentation. If you were to even do something just very low grade like mead or something, has a very tiny, or even wine has a very small amount of, it's really, you know, 10, 12%, 15%. Like if you're going to do, you know, not cook things necessarily, right? Or,
right.
You know, so,
or even just, I've heard a lot of people talk about weed, that like weed 50 years ago is so much different.
Even when I was in high school compared to weed now is unbelievable. It's a completely different, it's a whole different ball game.
They're just breeding the heck out of it. And there's there's hundreds of different strains.
Yeah, thousands, I'm sure.
I mean, that's just one plant. So perhaps the weed plant was here, and you know, maybe it was, you could use it for medicine, and now it's just ultra concentrated. They've crossed species, they've done all kinds of things, and they've made it so potent where you smoke it now and you almost have a hallucinogen.
Yeah, eating it especially, you can absolutely hallucinate like crazy. Even, you know, LSD, which people want to say is this synthetic thing, is just ergot fungus, right? It can grow on wheat, which some people think that may have been what the Salem witch trials were about.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yep. Yeah, which you know, maybe that seems like it would have taken quite a lot, but you know, all these things.
Yeah, because there's people who just like eat the coca leaves. They don't make cocaine out of them. They still
do that in the Andes. It helps with altitude sickness. A lot of
and energy.
So
some, when you get off the plane, chew on them. It helps with altitude sickness. Yeah,
it's medicine.
There's medicine. It's medicine. There are
and energy. It's like their Red Bull. They chew on coca leaves and they just go all day long. I don't know. I mean, I don't know where the line is in terms of like when you're manipulating things and you're addicted to something versus it's helping you versus because it's almost a slippery slope too, where, because then it's like, okay, well then that would make people wearing glasses a perversion of God's plan, right? Because it's like, God wanted you to be blind, so what are you doing?
Right.
What are you doing spitting in the face of the Lord with those bifocals?
So you got into mushrooms, and I think mushrooms is one of those other examples too, where we talk about like there are so many that can kill you out there that it seems like trial and error would be you know, would be a tough one too, with everybody dying, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, which I would think
my buddy almost died from that in high school. He ate a death cap that looked exactly like a psilocybin mushroom, and he got violently ill and had to go to the hospital.
Damn.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is what I think, and I wanted to bounce this off of you. So, I mean, I want you to talk a little about what you saw on mushrooms to start, because I know we're working our way to sort of the ayahuasca DMT stage.
Yes.
But I do think that, and I'm interested I want you to hear you talk, and then I want to talk about some of the things we talk about with Kara and some of our other guests about accessing the spiritual realm in a way that isn't the design of God, right? Is maybe unsafe in that sense. Yeah.
And I guess to speak on it so I don't forget it, where I have landed, I think, with using hallucinogens in a spiritual setting, I've heard someone call it spiritual masturbation, which I thought was one of the greatest term for real, because what it does, you will think, I mean, I'll spit whatever. I do think about God and spirituality. The majority of the time, though, is I am self-focused. I am hyper-focused. I'm going inward. You have the ego death, is where you just kind of cease to be. Most of it, though, is thinking about you. I remember having a mushroom trip with my buddy in high school, and he became convinced that he is God and we are all God. And he's just started like screaming at me that like, you're God, like we're God. So for me, mushrooms, and it's pretty typical. Some hallucinogens will detach you from the world, and some things like mushrooms, especially, are like unifying to where you see everything as connected, like the trees to the earth, you to the trees, the sky to the trees, the leaves to the branches, the water to the sky. Everything has a breathing nature to it. Everything is kind of glowy and electric, and your own skin, it's a weird tactile sensation. Normal things become abnormal, and connection is probably connection, and pattern recognition is probably what you're not with mushrooms. It's the classic thing when people say like, oh, what did you see? Mushrooms, you're not really so much seeing things that aren't there as blending and distortions. When you close your eyes, you can definitely, or you sit in a dark room, you can definitely go on some visual called, there's OEV and CEV, which are open eye visuals and closed eye visuals. Closed eye visuals, you can go into the fractals and the patterns and geometric shapes and lights, things like synesthesia, where you can hear colors or see sounds. It's first and foremost, I guess, a massive perception shift in everything. So it's not things like LSD can be more visual, as far as things taking different shapes, things taking different appearances.
So you're not seeing entities like you were like on the Benadryl Dramamine stuff.
No, not as much. I would see, we did, the few times I would do it in the forest at night, there would be maybe some shadow people. Usually though, with mushrooms, most of the time it would be accompanied by a feeling of reassurance and comfort, unless you venture into quote unquote bad trip territory. I'm trying to think if I don't know if I had many demonic feeling experiences on mushrooms. I can recount the story of a pastor friend that I know that was a self-proclaimed mushroom apologist. Like he was trying to convert the masses to mushrooms. He thought it was the greatest thing ever. He thought that's how you viewed God. And he was out in the desert during a mushroom trip and got accosted by a group of demons that identified themselves as demons. And that experience converted him to Christianity. Mm-hmm. And he's that's on. If you want to listen to that, that's the Church and Other Drugs episode. Joe, the preacher. It's an intense story.
I love it. I love it. So one of the things, I don't know if you were done with that idea, but I think one of the arguments we make on our show is that when people see Bigfoot, there's a similar experience that happens over and over and over again for hundreds of years. When people report digging up a giant skeleton, they do this. They have the same report for 300 years. They're not digging up wild creatures. They're digging up the same thing. Bigfoot experience, the same thing. When they do drugs, they have the same experience. And so I think that leads credence to what is happening, right? It's not like people go out in the woods and like, I saw a wild T-Rex, I saw a crazy unicorn, I saw a 5-winged dinosaur with bird feet. No, we don't hear that stuff. We hear the same stories over and over and over again. And I think that the DMT elves, these weird creatures that people seem to have contact with, it's the
machine elves.
Yeah, what are they making contact with, and describe them, and what do you think they are?
There's an interesting thing about happening currently in the ayahuasca and DMT space culturally, is that from what I have heard, people around the globe, around the disc, excuse me, currently are they're encountering the same this like blue female deity. A lot of people call it mother ayahuasca, like it has a female connotation. And apparently a lot of people that are disconnected from each other and that aren't talking about this to each other have recently been seeing this female specific deity. A buddy of mine, this is like one of the funniest DMT stories I've ever heard, because I just think it's hilarious. He was like walking through, he's obviously stationary, but he's walking through this wilderness and he approaches this giant blue deity. I think this one was a male, and it turned around and so this is also a similar pattern, is that there's an overwhelming feeling that these things want to impart knowledge, that they're trying to communicate something to you. And he says that this thing was trying desperately to communicate to him. And he said that he just walked up to it and she goes, nah. And he just turned around, and like, that's how the trip ended. That he was like, yeah, you wanted to tell me something, but I just like, I don't know. I just didn't want to hear it. So I just turned around. I just think that is hilarious to me.
So that's some self-control, because you're totally stoned and you're like, no, I don't want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. Well, and I smoked DMT, which is a different experience. And the peak of that experience is called breaking through, where, there's kind of different plateaus for it, where you can just get sort of kind of high, you can sort of lose yourself, and breaking through is when full on the veil of reality is lifted from you. And also these experiences are like, most of them are like ineffable. Like, you really can't tell what happened. You can just sort of describe it. So almost in like a Looney Tunesian way, it was like the field of view in front of me unzipped like a curtain and was pulled back, and I saw the machine elves on either side of the curtain, essentially like looking like they were doing a kind of construction, like tinkering, toiling, doing some kind of something. And then I was catapulted, like sort of like a roller coaster, through the curtain that had been unzipped. And it really was like kind of like a zipper. And I saw the machine elves. And I saw the machine elves. And I saw the machine elves.
What do they look like?
So that experience, I almost can't really tell you, because like what my mind wants to tell me right now is like I'm envisioning David the gnome, like with a little white hat, but I don't think that is what I saw at the time. I like, if I had to describe it, it would just be legs, short spread legs, like spread eagle, like short ovular torso, circular head. But like I said, it's really hard because it's almost so you don't have a reference point to compare it to, because it's just so bizarre. There was another time, another hallucination I had, and this one was a combination of methamphetamine and research chemicals, where I remember seeing very small people on my body, on my arm and my hand, and I got fearful to the point that I took the edge of a knife and was scraping it on my arm, trying to get these things off. And that was more fearful feeling, like this should not be there. The ones that I saw on DMT, the feeling that came with it was like, those are supposed to be here. Like they work here. Like it was just,
it's like Santa's workshop.
Basically, like it was a matter of fact, like, of course. Like they work for the cosmos. I mean, like it's bizarre.
I find it fascinating that this is not this is a shared experience, not a one-off. Like your experience is in line with what a vast majority of people that unzip this realm, however you want to put it, see these machine elves, right? That are doing some kind of task where they're writing on tablets or they're building little machines. There's this is something that people see. It's crazy to me because I think, like Nate had said in the beginning, just to reiterate, that like it leads a ton of credence to the idea that there is something going on here, especially when you look at the history of how it was used, and the South American tribes use it to speak to their gods, and to use ayahuasca to speak to their gods, and to know their enemies' battle plans, and to build their structures. And I think I don't know if this happened to you. I was going to ask you next thing was, were you told or given like some kind of mission or knowledge? Because that is like 2/3 of people on DMT say that they are given some mission or knowledge or something to do that they're supposed to do from a being, entity, elf, something they find on that side.
The only time I felt like I was given thoughts that were not my own and urgings and impulses was when I was heavy into phenylalamines, research chemicals. These are things called, like, a guy named not Alexander Shulgin. Maybe it was Shulgin. Things like 2CI, 2CB, 4-MeO, DMT, which is, some of these are similar to frog venom. If you've heard of like licking toads, that whole thing. That is a potent experience right there. And I was doing these things constantly, and I would do, I don't want to, like, it almost seemed like channeling, where, I mean, I had wall scrawlings where I was just constantly like writing. But the main thing I remember being pushed towards was like suicide. Like it was like, kill yourself. Like, don't, it was very, very, very dark. It was a very, very dark thing. I would get violent thoughts, violent images. I remember seeing a hallucination of a dog that had been split in half from the rib cage, and the bottom legs were gone and its entrails were hanging out, and it was dragging itself across my living room floor by its front paws and just kind of staring at me like a jackal-esque looking dog. That was one of the scariest things I've ever seen in my life. And like, I saw it. It was just it was a super dark time where I just felt, and like the suicidal thoughts did not seem, they weren't in my voice. They didn't seem like they were coming from me necessarily.
Yeah.
So I've never I've never had the experience of any missions or communications or like secrets of the universe type things.
Well, shoot.
Yeah.
I know. Well, I mean,
we wanted you to tell us about the Tablet of the Watchers.
Yeah, where it is.
Where is it?
I know. I did have, and I wrote this down, and now it seems like a stoner thought, but
a idea.
But I wrote this down in my journal, and it was that since Nephilim got punished, since the Watchers got punished for physically procreating, they figured out that they can promulgate their spirits through drugs. So they can still communicate through people through these hallucinogenic experiences.
That's interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah. And it makes me think about, you have a dream and your brain is sort of creating a universe from experiences you've already had, right? And so scary things happen, but you always can wake up and describe what it is. It sounds like when people are on drugs, they're having a really hard time because it's like they're having experiences that seem outside of their mind making it up.
Yes.
They're accessing something that's not in their head already.
No, I think that's a good point, Nate. Like, I've read a bit about DMT, and we got an expert here in Jed, but like 75% of people that have these experiences don't think that's from their head. They think it's an actual real experience, that these are real entities. These aren't like something that they conjured or created or pulled from their subconscious, that these are actual
that's what
things, beings, guides, spirits. People say alien or helper, elves and angels. Like there's just, and so maybe that's what I think I want to ask you, Jed. How do you fit all this into the paradigm? Maybe that's my best question. Because we come from the same biblical paradigm. So if you were to sort of summarize this and kind of put it and say this is what I think is happening, this is what I think happens with drugs, this is how it fits into my biblical worldview. I mean, how would you place these things and sort of in your kind of unpacking that? And that's probably a loaded question, but
no, it's a question. It is a question that I think about often, though. So I will tell you where I'm currently at, and I don't know if I'll stay here, but this is where I'm at. I think that God, Yahweh, can speak to us how he chooses. I think he can use many different ways to do that, including drugs. I think it is possible. Like, for instance, and this gives me an icky feeling on one hand, but I know people who have viewed mushrooms as a sacrament. They have prayed over it. They have prayed before it with the intention of hearing from Christ and hearing from God during that trip. That's what they set out. That was the intention, and they have done that. I can't necessarily pass judgment on what that experience is. Do I think that is what God has for me? No, because it immediately becomes idolatrous. And I mean, I'm an addict, and I cannot use it responsibly. I can't use it necessarily in that way. I also, if I was sort of like a screw tape letter scenario, if I was a demon, if I was a Nephilim spirit and I wanted to influence humans, I would find a way to bring them to my level so that I could communicate to them. And I think that hallucinogens, that certain chemicals, that certain plants can do that. And I think that's what's happening. And I think people get influenced by these things. I think it's the devil comes to you as an angel of light. I think it's
deception, right?
It's deception. It's a false religion.
I mean, hearing you speak on this, I think I want to affirm this in some ways. The idea that some of these things cause you to go inward and you're a god is really Eastern religion stuff, right? Like God, you are God, God's inside of you. You can even say that some of the Mormon stuff that they're all God, we're all gods somehow. It is idolatry of self, right? Mm-hmm. And then I just think I find it interesting. I don't know where I land. I think that's why I like to hear your thoughts, because I think that like God gave us certain ways to access the spiritual realm, And it's prayer and fasting, it's prayer and supplication, it's the worship of God. These are ways that, and I think we've made these things so inert and so commonplace that we've forgotten the power that exists in these. And there are other ways. That's the way I look at it. And there's other ways to do that. I think some of the New Age stuff is very much onto that. But I think that is all slippery slope of deception to
it totally can be
to a counterfeiting of, which is right on brand for the enemy, is a counterfeiting of the real of sort of the real experience. And I don't know enough, and I think that's why it's interesting to think that maybe some people do have these accesses that are Jesus based, and I got to be honest, I get skeptical on that. But at the same time,
I do too.
I don't know. I don't know where to land because that isn't. I'm not. I don't pretend to be all knowing either. That's why we have this show.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know anything.
Well, you just take some mushrooms. You'll figure it out.
Yeah.
I will say this. I think me personally, anecdotally, I know more people who have come to believe in God because they have seen the devil, demons, evil spirits, the darkness, than people that have seen God and come to God because of drugs that way. It's definitely more. It's more the former.
Well, sleep paralysis will do the same thing to you, man. It'll. I've woken up saying the name of Jesus so many times, and I think a lot of people have. I mean, and the same thing can happen for just seeing a Sasquatch. I mean, it sounds so stupid, but it's like you see something like that, and it blows your mind. You don't know how to make sense of anything after that moment, right? And whatever thing you do, whatever pulls back the curtain, the veil, it could be a drug, it could be an experience, it could be a nightmare, it could be a near-death experience.
Because fasting too, I mean, that's creating an altered consciousness. I mean, it's even Jesus in the wilderness. I mean, exhaustion. I'm sure fasting was part of that. Things like that do. Yeah, I mean, the mind, body, spirit connection is super interesting, and there does seem to be something to in all Christian included tradition. There seems to be something to changing your perception and consciousness from that of your day-to-day fleshly stone and concrete, wood and water reality to something more spiritual. It's like you're doing these things that are kind of separating you from this fleshly cage.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting you say that people come to a faith. I think that's not surprising in some ways, based on the idea that we live like in a spiritually neutered world where really the best sort of strategy of the enemy is to make you think that nothing exists, nothing is real. There's no spiritual realm. There's no Jesus, no God. None of that's true, right? And so when people have these experiences, whether they be Christ centered or not, they have these interactions with the spiritual realm. I think people wake up. I think, and that's interesting to me, because I think that's sort of a backfiring of the plan that maybe the darkness would have for accessing the spiritual realm in a way that isn't sort of the way that God laid it out necessarily. Now, yeah, we live in a spiritually bankrupt era for the church as well, right? So I don't find it surprising that people seek these things out either, because the church is no longer a place for people to get spiritually filled up. And,
yes, that's a great point.
And so I think they're looking at other things, and I think that can also be something that goes wayward, right? It's an interesting paradigm, because I think that's why the New Age movement is having to come back again, and it had even had sort of had feet when it started in the 60s, 70s, is that people were looking for something that was greater, right? And they found a way to get into these places. Traditionally, if you lived, I would imagine, as an early first century Christian, or even in the Golden Age, this was just commonplace. Like you had interactions with a very spiritual. The spiritual was as real as the physical, and there was no separation really for the ancients either. So.
And these things in antiquity, and I mean these things. This is a Graham Hancock thing, but he viewed these as spiritual technology. And back then, when you asked earlier about is this part of God's plan or not? There was so much more respect. This wasn't a recreation. This wasn't, I'm getting high, I'm trying to expand my mind. These were like serious rituals. These were serious. These were not to be taken lightly. This wasn't something you're doing at a keg party Friday night, as it is today. It's not some teenager. These were serious things. And there was a respect to it. And I also say, because I get asked from Christians quite a bit, like, should I trip, or should I do mushrooms, or should I do this? And my unequivocal answer these days is prayerfully ask God. I mean, I'm not gonna say that is 100% between you and God. That's but I would listen to whatever answer you get.
Yeah, and it's hard because often it feels like the voice of God is a still, quiet one. It's not the loud one that's in your head and in your ear. It's something that you have to tune out everything else out to hear. And I can only count on my hands a number of times where I felt like I heard something, and it's not easy. It's not easy to be a Christian. It's not easy to navigate the spiritual world. And sometimes we do get bored. And a lot of people say, like people are searching after a spiritual high and they go to certain churches to get high. And
shortcut. It's like a shortcut or a fix.
Yeah, those drunk in the spirit people.
And it's
like the Kundalini movements and stuff. And
yeah.
And I guess that speaks to the hunger for it. Like we're starving for it.
Yeah,
something's missing. Like otherwise, these things wouldn't be popular. I mean, we are absolutely, as a society, starving for a spiritual feeling.
Yeah, and you got Rogan talking about doing DMT now.
Yes,
and because you have a whole audience of people who are like, I don't buy the evolution narrative. I don't buy the scientific narrative. And I've been lied to for the last 50 years by the mainstream. I mean, even if you don't have a spiritual compass, you still know you're being lied to by 90% of whatever's coming out of the mainstream. And so you listen to guys like Rogan and he says, yeah, doing DMT and flying to outer space. You're like, you're 20 years old and you're like, yeah, I'm going to do it too. Because I'll trust Rogan over all this other crap, and it's a really strange time to be a human, but it is very much like all the desire and no history, no ancient history. So it's like the same thing that every ancient person had and every modern day person has is still there. I want to access God. I want to see the spiritual realm, but we have no knowledge of what actual ancient history is. I mean, it's much easier for David to have faith in God because he's literally surrounded by tribes of giants.
Right.
And we don't see giants today, so it's harder for us to have that kind of faith, right? Our giants are different. And they're more like under the surface or behind the smokescreen of nefarious elites and things like that, and satanic cults that are in the shadows. But back then it was more overt on the surface. They're gonna kill you. We can't go into the lands because they're there and they're gonna. So your faith is different. And nowadays it's just such a weird time to be a human being. And you've got these mouthpieces telling you have a spiritual experience, right. Go out and do this.
Do you think it's because we're all trying to get back to Eden? Do you think it's because we realize there's a piece of us that's missing, and it was that place where we walked with God, right? And,
sure. And
we lost that in the fall, right? And I do think there's something inside of us, and we're deeply spiritual beings as well as physical beings that longs for that interaction and I do think that's an easy thing to get twisted, and I think that's what we do see happen. And
it is.
And right, and then you talk about like the idea of spiritual practice, and that being a means unto a relationship or unto experiences with God. And it's like Nate kind of said, when you have no historical background or any reference point, then it's pretty easy to just be like, well, I'm going to push this button instead.
Well.
Right, because I can do this right now.
And it seems to be like the way of God in I mean, even in biblical time. I mean, the Bible's full of people just saying, where are you? Like, what is the deal? And it seems to be, sort of the the paradoxical nature of like the kingdom of heaven is that that's not God's way. It's not flashy in your face. You know, it'd be very easy for whatever reason. And I disagree. This is where me and God disagree very much so, but it's like, for whatever reason, he doesn't just come down here and stare us in the face, because, you know, that's his prerogative, and greater, you know, more faith is that hasn't seen and has faith.
Let's expound upon that idea, because it's like, so let's say the knowledge of the tree of good and evil was like a drug, right? We ate of the tree.
That was my first idea when I did mushrooms.
Yeah. Okay.
The tree, the fruit was a hallucinogenic.
Okay. But we were supposed to, so they wanted to give us knowledge, impart knowledge upon humanity. So let's say our elder race, angels, our older brother, whatever you call them, they had this knowledge, and human beings were, in a certain way, we were created to be naive, right?
Right.
Like, we weren't supposed to know all this stuff. We weren't supposed to have this knowledge, and then these entities gave it to us. They gave it to us in modern times. Some people, this week's episode, they say that's after Crowley comes, we have this explosion in technology.
Yep, the 60s UFO phenomenon.
Right after that. And then in the days,
which is coincidentally when LSD got banned.
That's interesting.
That's when the
and reefer madness.
Yep.
So what is it about this, or like, not like human beings were almost supposed to be like hobbits? We weren't supposed to have access to a lot of things that we want access to.
Oh, I almost see I think more it was the act of disobedience that poisoned the water for us, and it broke it separated us, or it's, you know, the knowledge of good and evil. I mean, I've had that idea about the internet age and how this overwhelming flood of knowledge is destroying us, because now, I mean, knowledge is essentially, facts and knowledge are essentially worthless, because you can find anything you need to know. And it's sort of,
I think it's swinging back though, Jed, because I think of all the lies that exist in this mountain of information, that it is starting to become, again, a commodity, right? The truth has become a commodity, or a treasurable or a valuable commodity. That's what maybe I'm looking for, because it's interesting though. That's an interesting point, that like it's like paralysis by analysis. We have so much information now.
I've never heard that. That's good. But yeah,
that like
we can't handle it.
Can't handle it.
But you started off this episode talking about Azazel taught us how to make swords and shields, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think humans would have figured out how to make those things if we were just left to our own, just human beings interacting with human beings. Would we ever have accumulated enough knowledge to make a sword and a shield? Mine metals, put them together, or we would have stayed more in a state of like Eden, in like a garden. So.
Well, we figured out how to kill each other. Obviously, that's with Cain and Abel, right?
We did with a rock. Yeah, it's like we do. We are incredibly inventive at that.
It does feel in that way, Nate, that like what they did was just accelerate our ability to sin.
They gave a toddler a handgun. It's like it was just too much too soon. That's why I love, like, this movie gets so much hate, but you've seen Noah, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Fantastic movie of the Book of Enoch.
It's just a Gnostic version of Noah.
But so much of it I love, like how the ancient but modern technology, where like they just have all these different like Noah has these just stones that make a fire immediately by crushing it. It's like it's modern technology, but it's just vastly different than we have. And then you had the armies of Tubal Cain, they're making the steel and they're eating meat, and they're you know, they've kind of been twisted.
Mm-hmm.
God, that I love that movie.
Okay. Well,
it's great. You need to go give it some rewatch.
Well, I think Christians just didn't like it because it was more of a Gnostic version of.
They didn't like it because it was the Book of Enoch.
Right, it was Enochian.
And they did kind of give the Watchers like a redemption arc, but whatever, man. God is God.
And the giants were a little weird. They were like stone rocks.
Yeah, well, but I love that representation. And when Luke, you were saying earlier basically about how we're like these spiritual beings, but in Noah, these spiritual beings fell to earth and they were encrusted with the earth and they're prisoners of hardened rock. And like, that's how I feel sometimes. It's like we are these spiritual things stuck in this flesh suit. And it's just like almost all of life sometimes is about that conflict between I've got one foot in the kingdom of God, and then I've got this other foot in this fallen world. And wretched man am I do the things I don't want to do, and I can't do the things I want to do. And it's like that's what it is. Like that's where we are. One foot in the kingdom of God, and one foot in the kingdom of God.
Well, the human beings are spiritually different than, say, angels. So what do you think that is then? What do you think God is trying to preserve in us? I mean, obviously it's an experience. You go through this life and maybe you see God differently.
Oh, yeah, that's a great point.
Maybe you see God differently at the end of it that an angel couldn't experience and couldn't see God the same. I mean, we're almost created for a different reason.
Yeah. I mean, the reason seems to be partnership and kinship versus employee
family.
Yeah, like the angels and the heavenly host and the divine council all seem to be, I don't want to denigrate them and say employees, but sort of. And whereas humans, it's a loving, it's a relational.
They're in the Father's house, so to speak, and we're not. We're the children. We are the heirs. There is something. And we're all sons of God. We're just a different breed of son of God.
Right. And I'm the favorite. I hate to tell you.
I know. And you have the best mustache of all.
Yeah, dude, bro. A machine elf told me I needed to grow it at exactly 34 years of age. So I don't know what's going to happen, but that's why I'm doing it.
Machine elf.
And you said you got no impartation of knowledge.
Well, he told me I couldn't tell
until now.
I love this conversation. I mean, obviously we talk about creatures on our podcast. We try to stay in those lanes. I need to go back and watch Noah again. And
you really do.
We give people the keys and permission to get weird. And the Bible is definitely, the older I get, I think Bigfoot and things like Bigfoot are a gift. If we didn't have weird experiences like that, I just don't think I would have read the Bible the way I do now. I wouldn't have been able to believe that the weird stuff happens. Like, animals talking, and even just Moses was told, speak to the rock, and he hits it with crap. It freezes every time. But he's told to speak to the rock, and he hits it with this, instead. And, young Nate probably thought both of those things didn't happen. And now I'm like, no, he had this power to do something, and he was, even in his rebellion, was still able to do something miraculous, Yeah. And
for sure.
And I do believe those things happened. I do believe that maybe some aspects of them were a little bit different, but I do think all those weird, crazy stories in the Old Testament, they happened. And maybe doing drugs helps you believe.
Yeah, well, and that's what I was gonna say. Like the one person I would emphatically endorse at least one mushroom trip would be the atheist. 100%. I mean, or even people like Dan who like struggle with supernatural. I'm serious. It's like really, like it'll let you know.
My old band member, for those listening.
Yeah. Things like that are like you just it's humbling. It's humbling is what
just
it is.
open your mind, man.
For real, bro.
You need to go on a spiritual ride along.
Yeah, I'll take him on a walkabout.
Yeah.
There you go.
And I think that, like, I just pray that he lives in Washington. I just pray a Squatch walks out in front of his car one night.
A Squatch holding an armful of mushrooms and just grabs them and stuffs them in his mouth.
Just freaks him out. Like, Nate, dude, I saw it.
Me.
Yeah.
I saw the big guy.
Come with me if you want to live.
Yeah.
No, but I mean, and we're all on this weird journey, and I don't know why, and we talk about this 1,000 times on our show, why Christians just delete the weird stuff. They just they remove it systematically. They remove it.
Yeah.
And it's just more and more people are emailing us like, man, I love your show. Like, I'm coming back to God. And I'm like, we didn't do anything except just say, hey, it's weird. And the weird stuff's the good stuff. That's it. That's all we've done.
I mean, my immediate thought was, because I just brought up the Jesus in the wilderness. It's like, okay, every Christian, we all believe in Jesus. So what do you do with the fact that, like, Jesus had a full-on couple-day conversation with Satan?
Yeah.
What, that was a metaphor? Is that what you're...
And he goes places and he sees things.
Right. Like, okay, but no, well, it was special because it was Jesus. Like, what? All right, okay, then why? Whatever.
I don't know, and we get weird on our show, but
Nate, this is what we do it for. We don't know. This is why we do it. Yeah.
Yep.
But all those places have significance, and the more you go back, it's like you got to go back and dust off your reading glasses.
We got to go back to the future.
All right.
I was just watching that last night.
Nice.
Marty!
That was a good conversation, man.
I love it. I mean, if we could go back, though, I think the three of us can agree. If we went back to the Golden Age, we would all just be like mesmerized. How wrong ancient history is.
Oh, yeah, and probably how wrong we are too. Like, it's probably nothing like we think.
Yeah.
Whatever we think it is, it's probably far different.
The empires of the God Kings were crazy. We talk about the giants and Jed. Tell the folks so they can listen to your wonderful podcast and get into your mind.
Yeah, it's Church and Other Drugs, Church & Other Drugs. You can find it on Spotify, Apple, iHeartRadio, Google Play, all the stuff. Yeah, it's everywhere. Everywhere you want to listen.
I'm just sad people don't see Bigfoot when they do drugs.
I'm sure some people do.
Sure they have.
I'm sure they have. Yeah.
All right. Well, you have to Bigfoot. You don't have to do drugs to see Bigfoot. You can just go in your backyard and see him if you know what to do. And Luke knows.
If you play the Native American flute, you can call him right in.
I was just gonna say, Luke knows what to do. We have learned a thing or two, Jed, since the last time you've been on our show. We really appreciate it.
So when is the Blurry camp? Like, when is the
Blurry
expedition?
Con? Well,
I'm talking.
No, he's
Expedition.
talking about Expedition Blurry.
Yeah.
We're getting there.
All right, I'm in whenever you do that. 100%.
Tim wants to take us to some places in Montana. We could probably do it. Maybe like an you buy a ticket, covers your meals, and we go out and we get Duke and whoever else to go with us. Luke,
Tom Seward,
and find a Squatch,
dude.
All right, deal. Duke said he can get us on Squatch 70% of the time. I'm gonna hold him to it.
Yeah.
That's a bold claim.
He was our first guest.
That's our disclaimer. You're like, really? All right. 70% of people who out with you see a Squatch?
Have an experience. That could be.
Have an experience.
Oh, okay. So he just slips him some mushrooms, is what?
Or he just creeps out at night.
No, they don't see Squatch on shrooms. We've already determined that.
Right.
Well, Jed, it was great to see you, man.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah, man. Good to see you boys.
Yeah, and our episode with you, it's still getting downloaded, and people are still loving the Book of Enoch.
Hell yeah.
I love it, dude. Thanks for
living, baby. Livin.
Yeah, go check out Church and Other Drugs podcast, And thanks for coming on our show. And we don't have anything to offer your podcast, but I'm glad you can come on ours and drop the goods.
For sure, man.
Yep.
Unless you want to talk Sasquatch, we'll do it all day long.
All right, sounds good.